Imagine this. It is late 1944. Some of you watching this may remember the headlines, the newsreels, the ration books in your kitchen drawers. American boys are fighting across France, in Italy, in the Pacific. Every letter from overseas could be the last. Now picture a different front line. A German army surgeon, 40-something years old, father of two, stands behind barbed wire in North Carolina. He has just been shipped across the Atlantic as a prisoner of war. For years, he has operated in ruined churches and cellars. He has cut off shattered limbs without proper anesthesia. He has watched young men bleed to death because there were no antibiotics. He is sure that his own life is almost over. He expects a trial, maybe a firing squad, or at best brutal labor, until he collapses. Instead, an American officer in a white coat walks up, looks him in the eye, and says one thing in careful German, "Herr Doktor." The German almost doesn't understand. He is not prisoner number so-and-so. He is doctor again. A few minutes later, he stands in a clean ward at Camp Butner, North Carolina, one of the major convalescent hospital centers established by the United States Army during the war. On a small metal table in front of him lies a glass vial and a syringe. On the desk beside it, a freshly delivered medical journal, printed in German. He picks up the journal with shaking hands. He opens it and sees the latest articles from around the world. Back home, most of this material has been blocked or delayed by war and censorship. He looks through the window at a wounded German private lying in a bed, an enemy soldier on American soil. A U.S. Army nurse checks the dressing on the man's leg. Then an American doctor reaches for that glass vial. Penicillin, the drug that by 1944 is starting to save more lives than any bullet can take. The German surgeon realizes that this miracle medicine, which he has barely seen in his own army, is about to be used on a German prisoner in an American hospital. His throat tightens. He sits down clutching the journal. In that moment, with tears in his eyes, he understands something his government never told him. Here, on the other side of the ocean, his enemy is treating his wounded and treating him as if their profession matters more than their uniforms. This is the true story of German prisoner of war doctors in the United States at places like Camp Butner in North Carolina and Fort Sam Houston in Texas between 1944 and 1946. A story of fear, respect, and how professional honor quietly outlived the war. Let's go back to the world of 1944. Many of you remember it not from history books, but from your own childhood. Ration stamps, scrap drives, newspaper columns with lists of the missing. By mid-1944, the United States was holding hundreds of thousands of German prisoners of war on its own soil. They were brought in after battles in North Africa, Italy, and later from Western Europe. By the war's end in 1948, more than 4,000 or 5,000 Axis prisoners, approximately 3,000 of them German, were held in over 650 camps across the United States. One of the largest POW complexes in North Carolina stood near the little community of Butner, not far from Durham and Raleigh. Camp Butner had been built as a vast training and hospital center for the U.S. Army. It included a major convalescent hospital complex, rows of wards and clinics caring for soldiers recovering from wounds and illness. Farther south and west in Texas, Fort Sam Houston in San Antonio served as a key hub for Army medical training and treatment. It was already known as the home of Army medicine and home of the combat medic. During the war, space at Fort Sam Houston was made available for up to 1,000 German prisoners of war, including medical personnel who would be exposed to American military medical education and training methods. At the same time, German military medicine was under enormous strain. Field hospitals followed retreating units. Supplies dwindled. Bombing raids hit not just factories, but clinics and city hospitals. German doctors at the front did what they could with what they had. They often worked with outdated equipment, limited anesthetics, and almost no access to new drugs like penicillin. When these men were captured and shipped to the United States, most of them expected the laws of war, the Geneva Convention, to exist only on paper. They braced themselves for revenge. What they found instead, in many American camps, was something far more complicated and far more human. Imagine arriving at Camp Butner in late 1944 as a German prisoner. The transport trucks grind to a stop. You climb down with hundreds of others, infantrymen, NCOs, artillery crews under the watchful eyes of armed guards, barbed wire, guard towers, neat lines of wooden barracks. For most prisoners, the next step is predictable: registration, search, assignment to work details. But for a select group, the process suddenly changes. American officers begin reading through personnel lists and service records. They pull out anyone with medical training. Who among you is a physician? Who has served in a field hospital? Any surgeons, internists, specialists? Our German surgeon, let's call him Dr. Weber, steps forward. He studied medicine in Berlin before the war, trained in surgery, and spent the last years on the Eastern Front. In Germany, his rank and specialty brought both responsibility and danger. Here, he doesn't know what they will bring. At an improvised intake office, an American officer in medical uniform interviews him. How many years of training? What kind of surgery? Have you worked with battlefield trauma? The questions are clinical, not angry. The tone is firm, but something else is there too: professional curiosity. Then comes that unexpected phrase, Herr Dr. Weber. For a moment, the noise of the camp seems to fade. He is still a prisoner. He still wears a faded field gray uniform. But that title, Doctor, restores a piece of his identity that the war had nearly crushed. He is told he will be assigned, under guard, to work in the camp's medical facilities. Not digging ditches, not breaking rocks, in a hospital. For American officers, this was not an act of charity. By late 1944, U.S. Army medical staff were stretched thin. Hundreds of thousands of wounded men had passed through military hospitals worldwide. Experienced doctors and nurses were needed everywhere. Using the training of captured German physicians under American supervision was in many ways simple common sense. But how it felt to those German doctors, the shock, the relief, the confusion, that is what gives this story its power. Now, follow Dr. Weber through the doors of the Camp Butner hospital complex. The contrast with the Eastern Front could not be sharper. Clean floors, bright lights, a steady hum of activity. American orderlies push wheelchairs between wards. Nurses in crisp uniforms check charts at the foot of each bed. You can smell disinfectant instead of smoke and blood. The convalescent hospital system at Camp Butner handled thousands of neuropsychiatric and medical cases during the war years. German prisoners would help care for a portion of that patient load, always under U.S. authority. In a small preparation room, An American surgeon shows Dr. Weber the layout: operating theaters with proper surgical lights, sterilizers for instruments, cabinets filled with bandages, sutures, and bottles of modern drugs. For a man used to improvising clamps from workshop tools and boiling instruments in battered pots, it is like stepping decades into the future. Then comes the heart of it. On a small tray lies that glass vial: penicillin. In early 1944, penicillin was still relatively scarce, but by mid-1944 and into 1945, American production had increased dramatically. It began to flow through military hospitals in Europe and at home. U.S. doctors explain how they use it: dosages timed carefully through the day, combined with surgery to clean out infected wounds, saving limbs and lives that once would have been written off. Dr. Weber listens in a mixture of amazement and quiet shame. In his field hospitals, men with similar wounds had died in rows. Sometimes all he could offer was a few drops of morphine and a hand squeezed in apology. Here, the enemy has enough of this miracle drug to use it not only on their own, but also, shockingly, on captured German soldiers. As Weber stands there, an American physician, perhaps a man like Captain James Miller from Ohio, looks at him not as a defeated enemy, but as someone who can help. "You have seen many of these injuries on the Eastern Front," the American says. "Tell me how you stabilize them in the field." Two men on opposite sides of a world war begin to talk, not about borders or battles, but about bone splints and blood loss. Over the following months, daily life in the camp hospitals settled into a rhythm. In the morning, American and German doctors walked the wards together for rounds, down one row of beds. American infantrymen recovering from surgery, down another row. German prisoners with shrapnel wounds, infections, or old injuries, finally getting proper care. Case by case, they compared notes. For trauma and battlefield injuries, the German surgeons often had unmatched experience. Many had worked through the worst years of the fighting in Russia and elsewhere, dealing with massive blast wounds, freezing injuries, and near-constant shortages. American doctors learned trauma treatment techniques from German colleagues who had extensive battlefield experience. The Germans taught their American counterparts how to improvise traction and splinting for bad fractures, decide quickly when to amputate to save a life, recognize which wounds, even if they looked awful, might still be saved with aggressive treatment. In return, American doctors opened a different world. German doctors learned about American advances in antibiotics, anesthesia, and surgical techniques. Organized surgical teams with clear division of roles, wider use of anesthesia techniques that reduced pain and risk, systematic use of antibiotics, penicillin and sulfa drugs to control infection. In many camps, German physicians were given supervised access to medical libraries and journals. They could read articles they had only heard rumors of before. Some of these journals had been difficult or impossible to obtain in wartime Germany. In consultation rooms, U.S. and German doctors gathered for what we today might call case conferences. An American officer would present a difficult patient, perhaps a soldier with multiple limb injuries and infection. The German doctors would offer their ideas, drawing on brutal frontline experience. Then the Americans would explain how they might combine surgery with new drugs and better anesthesia to increase the odds. In those discussions, the front lines disappeared There were no propaganda posters. There were x-rays and lab reports. What mattered was not who had worn which uniform, but which approach gave a broken young man in a hospital bed his best chance at going home. Camp Butner was not the only place where this quiet cooperation unfolded, but it is a powerful example. German POWs, including doctors, were a small but important part of the medical system. They examined patients, first German, then sometimes Americans, always under American authority. They assisted in surgeries. They helped with rehabilitation, teaching men to walk with braces, to use canes, to adapt to new limitations. They did this work as prisoners, watched by guards, going back to fenced compounds at night. Yet, within the hospital walls, once the white coats were on, many American staff reported that the atmosphere changed. Doctors told stories about their medical school days. They argued about the latest theories in internal medicine. They shared the same dark humor that comes from living every day with life and death decisions. At Fort Sam Houston in Texas, a major wartime and post-war medical center known as the home of Army medicine, similar patterns emerged. German prisoners with medical training were assigned to support work in the medical system, seeing the inner workings of one of the Army's key hospitals. German medical personnel at Fort Sam Houston were exposed to American military medical education and training methods. This created an integrated medical environment where German medical staff worked alongside American colleagues. For young American physicians there, exposure to German colleagues was like a crash course in what total war on the Eastern Front had done to human bodies. For German doctors, Fort Sam Houston and places like it offered a look at how a large, well-resourced military medical system could function at its best. It is important to remember the guards did not put down their rifles. The barbed wire did not vanish. No one forgot that a brutal war was still being fought overseas. But inside those hospital corridors, something else took root: respect based on competence, and a shared belief that the wounded deserved help no matter what language they spoke. The medical facilities at these camps varied, but generally exceeded what German medical officers expected. German doctors were addressed by their medical titles, consulted on medical cases, and included in medical discussions. The quality of equipment and supplies in these facilities often exceeded what German military hospitals had possessed even before the war's destruction of German medical infrastructure. The American Medical Corps generally provided the same care to wounded German prisoners as to Allied casualties. This professional courtesy was not merely symbolic. None of this happened in a vacuum. Since the interwar years, the United States had been a party to the Geneva Convention on the treatment of prisoners of war. Those rules required humane treatment, adequate food, and medical care for captured soldiers. American commanders had two powerful reasons to take those obligations seriously. First, principle. Many officers genuinely believed that even in war, there were lines that a civilized nation should not cross. Doctors, especially, were trained to see their duty as rising above politics when a human life was at stake. Second, pragmatism. Thousands of American servicemen were held in German and Japanese camps. How the United States treated enemy prisoners could influence how its own men were treated in return. By allowing German doctors to use their medical skills under supervision, American authorities achieved several goals at once. They eased the burden on overworked U.S. medical staff. They met their legal obligations to care for prisoners. They sent a powerful message about the kind of country America claimed to be. When inspectors from organizations like the Red Cross visited, they could see more than barbed wire and barracks. They saw functioning hospital wards where enemy doctors were unexpectedly part of the team. To many German prisoners, this was their first real encounter with an America very different from the enemy described in Nazi propaganda. The ability of American medical personnel to separate professional duties from national enmity provided German medical officers with a model of medical ethics that transcended political ideology. In May 1940, Germany surrendered. The war in Europe was over, though the fight in the Pacific continued until August. Slowly, the massive machine of American wartime logistics began to reverse itself. German prisoners, including doctors like our Dr. Weber, were processed for repatriation. For some, this took months. Many POWs remained in U.S. custody through 1940 and into 1946 as transportation was arranged and as post-war policies were worked out. Out of the more than 5,000 Axis prisoners held in over 60 camps, only about 222 German POWs ever escaped from their camps, and most were recaptured within a day. The vast majority, including the medical staff, waited patiently for their turn to go home. When their time came, the doctors packed what little they owned, a few clothes, maybe a Bible, perhaps a notebook full of medical observations. Some carried home mental lists of what they had learned in Dramatic hospitals, how antibiotics were dosed, how wards were organized, how nurses were trained and trusted with critical tasks. A few were even allowed to take medical reprints or journals back with them, a treasure in a country whose libraries and clinics had often been bombed or looted. They boarded ships not knowing exactly what waited on the other side. A Germany in ruins, cities like Cologne, Dresden, and Hamburg heavily damaged, hospitals overcrowded or destroyed, millions of displaced people needing care. What they did know was this: they had seen a different model of medicine in practice. They had worked in hospitals where resources, when available, were distributed according to need, not party standing. They had been treated, in spite of everything, as doctors. In the years after 1940, as West Germany rebuilt its medical system, many of these former POW physicians quietly wove those experiences into their work. They taught younger doctors about penicillin and its cousins. They argued for better training of nurses and for more modern hospital administration. They carried with them the memory of American colleagues who had addressed them not as defeated enemies, but as fellow professionals. The experience of German POW medical personnel in American captivity demonstrates that professional identity can transcend national enmity. For ordinary German soldiers, life in American POW camps could be a mixed picture, sometimes boring, sometimes tense, often overshadowed by worry about families back home. For German doctors who had worked in camp hospitals, the memories were often more complex. They remembered long discussions over treatment plans. They remembered American surgeons explaining why they chose one operation over another. They remembered, above all, that word doctor. Many later told interviewers and researchers that their time in the United States changed how they saw their former enemy. The country they had been taught to hate as decadent and cruel had, in some of its hospitals at least, treated them with a level of professional respect they had not always received from their own regime. This did not erase the horrors of the war. It did not excuse what the Nazi government had done, but it planted a seed. In the 1950s and the 60s, as West Germany and the United States became allies in the Cold War, those personal memories helped build bridges. It is one thing to read about a foreign country in a leaflet. It is another to have held a stethoscope next to one of its sons while you both listened to the same wounded heartbeat. If you're watching this today as a retiree, you may remember those wartime years vividly. You may recall the gold stars that appeared in neighbors' windows. You may have waited for news from Europe or the Pacific. You may have lost friends, classmates, even family. Nothing in this story is meant to minimize that loss. What it does show is that even in the darkest times, some people chose to live by a different standard. American doctors and nurses working in places like Camp Butner and Fort Sam Houston between 1944 and 1944 did not have to treat German physicians as colleagues. They did not have to share techniques, discuss difficult cases, or hand over medical journals printed in the enemy's language. But many of them did. German doctors, in turn, did not have to open up about their hard-won experience on the Eastern Front. They could have withdrawn, done only the minimum. Yet, in ward after ward, operating room after operating room, former enemies set those fears aside, long enough to save lives. For the German surgeon you met at the beginning of this story, that moment in the small consultation room at Camp Butner changed everything. He came to America expecting death or degradation. He left having seen a country where, at least within the walls of a hospital, a man could be judged not by his uniform, but by his skill and his oath. As you think about your own family, children or grandchildren who may serve or already have served, you can take something from this. War will always test nations. But the way we treat the vulnerable, even when they wear an enemy's uniform, says more about our character than any victory parade. In the end, in those quiet hospital corridors in North Carolina and Texas, white coats did something uniforms could not. They turned enemies into colleagues and left behind a legacy of respect that outlived the war itself.